Hello there. Now, if you've watched television for years like I have, there's a couple of words that could really scare you. We're calling the grand jury, or you're going to go before the grand jury. I just remember those words. Well, we have somebody who's not scaring me at all, but we have a representative of the grand jury, Jim Reagan. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here.
Tell us, what is the grand jury in San Luis Obispo? Should people be afraid if they hear about it?
Absolutely not. Our grand jury consists of 19 people selected by the Superior Court to come together for a year to investigate county government, local government, study to find out how efficiently it's running. Maybe it could be run more efficiently.
So it's not there to send people to jail?
That's correct.
It's a study group?
It is a study group, that's right.
And you have served on it?
I served about 5 years ago.
As I was saying to you, so did I serve on it. A lot of people have. Now, you get on it how?
This is the time of the year that you apply. People maybe have seen ads in the newspaper and in the Tribune. There are certain qualifications, but you get an application from the courts. You apply. The deadline this year for the grand jury beginning in July is April 18th. So you make an application, and then the judges look at your application. If they determine that you meet the minimum qualifications, then a judge will interview you to talk to you about your own experiences and making sure that maybe you don't have a particular agenda that you'd like to pursue on the grand jury. And then they select 30 people, and they put them in a pool. And then,
well, actually, they put their names in a container. We don't go swimming at all, because I've been there, yeah.
Thank you. That helps.
It's okay.
And then they draw the 19 by lot from the 30, so that you're number 1 through 30, and the first 19 get on, unless you can hold over and serve for 2 consecutive terms if the judge would allow you to do that. The first 19, and then the remaining 11 are alternates.
Right, but not 19 from 1 to 19. It's the number they draw out of the hat. You're each assigned a number. They pull your name out.
That's right. And you each get a number, and your first 19 are those who serve on the grand jury.
And isn't there an alternate?
And then the rest are alternates.
They're all alternates, but
they remain in the jury. Their names remain in the jury pool.
Because the year I served, we had to draw 3 from the alternates because of somebody dropped out and things like that, and they had to bring up the alternates.
I think virtually in every year they have people who drop out for whatever reason. Maybe they discover that, well, this is not quite what I wanted to do. They have illness problems. So there are a lot of reasons why you.
Now, what are the qualifications that you should have in order to do it? I mean, minimum qualifications. There's no age qualification.
You have to be 18 or older.
All right.
You have to be a resident of the county for at least a year.
Okay.
You have to be of sound mind and faculty. That's probably a little judgmental there.
That's what I was going to think, yeah.
You have to speak English, have a good competency in English. You can't be serving on a jury at the moment, nor can you be an elected official. And you can't have been convicted of a felony or malfeasance in office. Those are the main qualifications.
Okay. Barring that, then you have a chance of being one of the 30 that they will select.
That's correct.
Now, there are still someplace grand juries that hear cases and do things other than what you said we do in this county, which is investigate government.
In fact, today we have grand juries in this county and the state that look at criminal matters.
Okay.
And what a district attorney might do is to call a grand jury specifically for that purpose, to look at a series of maybe criminal indictments. But that is not the grand jury I'm talking about. That is a jury that is selected from the regular jury rolls.
Oh, they will select someone from the regular jury rolls to serve on a criminal grand jury.
Which probably it might be in existence for a couple of months or maybe less.
Now, can those people, you can't serve on that if you're on your grand jury, of
That's
course.
correct.
And when you're on the grand jury for the year term that you're on, are you also exempt from regular jury service?
You are.
So that would say you couldn't do that.
In fact, right now, I think if people were applying and they then got a jury summons, they could postpone their current jury service until they found out whether or not they got on the regular grand jury if they applied.
Okay, now, are there any geographical reasons for choosing people? Do they try to get a cross-section of the county?
No, I had thought that was true at one time, but we talked to, just a couple of days ago, talked to one of the judges, and that is not one of the criterion. They're just looking for, they're trying to get as many people as they can, and they're hoping to get a broad geographical representation, but that is not a requirement.
They don't have to balance it.
No, they don't have to.
They don't have to balance it by men and women or anything like that.
No, they don't. It's not a jury of the peers. So that
the 30 don't have to be balanced, and the fact that you're going to pull 19 out of them, they can be completely unbalanced for all you know when you pick them out of this.
Although from what I've seen, it works out that.
Well, chances are.
Geographically, you would expect probably more people to be from San Luis, maybe from South County, but it always has seemed to be over the last several years at least one from Cambria, and that's where I live. So.
Well, that's interesting. Now, how much time does it take out of a person's life for that 1 year that they're on the grand jury? How many?
We generally say about 20 hours a week, which would involve in various grand jury meetings. And then when we're doing investigations, we would be interviewing people, and that would be extra to those meetings. It's more intense at certain times than others. If you're really involved in one investigation, you might be spending more time. But
all right. Now, do you get paid for this?
Practically speaking, no. You get $15 a day, whether you spend it or not, and that pretty much I think covers maybe your lunch, or at least a portion of your lunch when you're meeting downtown San Luis Obispo. But just $15 a day. That's whether you worked an hour or all day. But you don't get that money if you're working on grand jury business. Say you're working at your computer at home, you don't get that money for that time.
Okay, you just get it for going to meetings.
And for doing the interviews.
Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the job of the grand jury is to investigate government, and you investigate the sheriff's department,
mm-hmm.
next year you investigate them again? Or do you just rotate the parts that you investigate?
Well, there are several ways. A grand jury can decide what it's going to investigate. It's a clean slate. Now,
each year.
There's one way that they can investigate is they receive complaints from people, and they can go and follow up on those complaints and use those complaints as the basis for investigations and reports. Or grand jurors get together and they read the newspapers and see what's relevant, what's going on in the county right now, and decide that, well, maybe it's time that we need to investigate this particular agency or this portion of the agency.
Okay, so there's no rule for what you have to do each year. You get to choose each year what you want to do.
The only thing you have to do is, and this is sort of an anomaly because we're talking about local government, the only thing you have to do is inspect the jails in the county every year. And that means, in this county, means CMC, even though that's a state institution. And until recently, it means the youth facility at Paso Robles. And then you would also inspect the county jail.
And not a Tescadero mental?
No, because there were court cases one court case a few years ago said that a Tascadero is a state hospital, is not a prison.
Okay. So you can investigate anything that people... Now, how can somebody get a complaint to the grand jury? What if I really think that something needs investigation? You got to definitely investigate the rhubarb department. So what do I do?
Well, the best thing to do would be to get a complaint form. You can get that from the grand jury has a website, and you can get it there.
I'm not on the internet.
You can also pick up a complaint form at the county courthouse. You can call the commissioner's office, and they will send you one. And it gives you. It's good to have that complaint because it tells you the kinds of information that would be useful for the grand jury to have in considering your complaint.
But you could actually write a letter, I suppose. I mean, right now, the names of the grand jurors are listed in the paper after they're picked in July, correct?
That's correct. You
could write a letter to one of them and say, you know that this is such and such?
Well, except you wouldn't know their address. You would write the complaint to the grand jury office. There is an address.
Okay. Or you could write a letter to the grand jury office.
You could. That's right.
If you're just not into going into town and getting this piece of paper and filling it out.
But you certainly should sign the letter. I mean,
yes.
An anonymous complaint will probably be tossed.
Okay, that's very good for you guys to know out there. If you want to complain about something, don't be anonymous. You have to sign your name and you have to get the information to the right person. And then what's going to happen? Then
the grand jury will log in this complaint, and depending on the subject matter, The grand jury organizes into various committees. Maybe in our grand jury, we had a committee that dealt with city government activities. We had one that dealt with county government agencies, another that dealt with law enforcement. So that if the complaint, if it looks like it's clearly into one of those areas, it would be given to the members of that committee, and they would do some preliminary investigation. They might call in the complainant. They would certainly examine the information that the complainant gave, and then they would come back to the grand jury, the full grand jury, and say, okay, we think we should pursue this complaint as an investigation, or we don't think we should pursue this complaint. And you need to have, in order to pursue an investigation, 12 of the 19 grand jurors have to say yes. So that if you're looking at a complaint, you have to get at least 11 other grand jurors to agree with you that you want to pursue it.
Now, theoretically, I've got the complaint, and that we need to pursue it. We investigate it, and we find it's valid, or we find it's invalid. Now, do you keep a list every year that you turn in at the end of the year saying, we investigated this and decided to do nothing, we investigated this and decided to do something? Do you have a whole list that goes up?
We keep those records, but I generally, that kind of log is destroyed at the end of the year. A grand jury has to start anew every year on its own investigations. Now, it could do a similar investigation that they did last year, but sometimes you might hold over some complaints if they came late in the year.
But what you're saying is the information that you've gotten is not of use to anybody later? It's wasted?
Well, I don't describe it as wasted. I think that generally you're going to be probably dealing with virtually all the complaints that you get. If you decide that you're not going to pursue the complaint, and there are a lot of reasons why you would decide to do that, you will write the person back and say, thank you very much, but we've decided that we won't pursue this complaint. Right,
but shouldn't there be a record to know that if 5 consecutive years in a row, a different person has complained about the same department doing the same thing, shouldn't there be a history so that you know, maybe there is fire here, we've got a lot of smoke?
I think you've probably got a very good point.
It just doesn't happen that way.
My experience on the grand jury was not that anybody said, oh, this person complained last year or 2 or 3 years ago.
Not that person, but that thing was complained about. Right. Okay, now.
Well, except there are, there are instances in which maybe one grand jury would not pursue something, but the next one would.
Yes.
And so there could be some record. I don't recall that in my service.
Okay, but you do make what we call the grand jury report at the end of the year.
Or you can, as several grand juries have done, issue reports throughout the year. And then you compile them all at the end of the year into one report. There's a great advantage to issuing reports throughout the year because you get better press. I mean, if you're doing 10 or 15 reports and they come out at the end, the press has to sort of pick and choose which ones it wants to highlight. Whereas if you put them out, a number of them out individually, you're going to get greater press on those. And also you have a good chance to get some agency response back on those reports before your grand jury goes out of business.
Okay, are they supposed to respond, or do they have to, or don't they?
They have to respond. They have to respond. The agency that you're investigating has to respond within 60 days.
To your report.
To the findings and to the recommendations. And the legislative body, the Board of Supervisors in the case of the county, or a city council in the case of the city, they have 90 days to respond. And the law is very specific on how they respond. If they say no, they're not going to implement a recommendation, they have to say why. Or if they say, well, it's going to take us more time, but we'll think about it. But those are the kinds of responses. They can't just stonewall the grand jury.
They can't just say, thank you very much. You've done a wonderful job. We're so happy to have your report.
That's correct. They can't say that.
They can't say that?
No.
Have they ever tried? Well, we don't know. Okay, that's, so has there ever been, do you remember do they talk about in the annals of grand juries, anything was really changed because you did a report and somebody responded to it?
I think there are a couple of examples that I can give over the last 10 years. One was, this was in the 2001-2002 grand jury. They had received a number of complaints from parents. This was Child Welfare Services in the Department of Health Services. And these parents said that they were being treated poorly by their case officers. Some cases, the children had been taken away from them and they didn't get the right answers. And there were maybe 10, 15 complaints that came into the grand jury. The grand jury took a look at this and then looked back at previous grand jury reports.
Okay, so they do have the reports of looking at the child welfare services, right, to look at.
And they went back over the several years, and previous grand juries had also looked at a similar situation and had recommended that some form of complaint system be set up that would deal with these people, but it was never implemented.
Oh.
So this grand jury looked at these complaints and said, well, we can't look at the individual complaints. We're not quick enough to resolve those issues, but maybe there is a problem with the system here. So they did a number of interviews, read an awful lot of documents, and came up with a recommendation for a complaint system and setting up what they called it was a review panel, so that people had if they felt they were be treated wrongly, they could go to this review panel of some independent people, including people in the community, to review their particular case. And after one false start, in which the department was still a little slow to implement it, they said they were going to implement it, they did implement it. And in fact, a former foreperson of the grand jury sat on that, or I think is still on that review panel, so that, but we learned recently that from maybe 5, 6, 7, maybe more complaints a year, last year I think there was only 1 or 2 complaints. So that there is an instance in which several grand juries were onto this. They were stonewalled for a number of years, but finally, I think it was a combination of the new event that time, the head of the Department of Health Services, Lee Collins, plus the grand jury, they finally clicked, and they basically solved a problem. And I think that's one great example.
That's a wonderful way to take our break. We're going to go to break. Excuse us, Jim. We're going to take a break on a positive note, something good that happened. We'll be back in just a moment with Jim Reagan and the grand jury. And we're back with James Reagan talking about the San Luis Obispo County Grand Jury, which is a review agency. And he just showed me a piece of paper that I found absolutely fascinating that we're going to tell you about. We can't read all of it, but it is
It's an index, a cumulative index of all of the San Luis Obispo County grand jury reports from 1980 through last year. And it's actually on the grand jury website that one can see this. And they've organized this all around various categories so that I think, for example, the San Luis Obispo Airport, well, it's been the subject of 9 or 10 different grand jury reports over that 20-year period.
Fabulous. I'm going to have to look at that because I want to see if they've got anything that my grand jury worked on. I will find that very interesting because we did do something that I thought was fabulous, but we're not going to talk about that. But what can we talk about? Speaking of grand juries, when are you allowed to talk and what can you talk about?
You're obviously allowed to talk about the reports once they are published, but the grand jury is one of the few government agencies which operates in the strictest secrecy. And the reason it does that is that if you're investigating an agency, particularly if someone's maybe complaining about it, maybe not operating as well as it might, you certainly wouldn't want that to be known to the general public or to the press before you completed your investigation. Because if it turned out that your report exonerated the agency completely and said they're doing a fantastic job, these people would have had the cloud over their heads for maybe 4 or 5 months that you're doing the report. Similarly, when someone makes a complaint, you can't do it anonymously, but we don't want the world to know that if a person is whistleblowing, for example, that in fact that gets out there, so that you sign an oath of secrecy, which is valid for the rest of your life, actually.
That's what I was wondering, for the rest of your life. On what part, though? On the information you've learned?
No, certainly not anything that is published. But if you learn some confidential information, if you learn some things in your interviews, and certainly to identify specifically who you interviewed or specifically what that person said, that's the kind of thing which you don't really want to get out.
Because I've often wondered, just for personal reasons, because as I told you, I served on a grand jury, and in my life was the most horrendous year I ever spent because of the caliber of my grand juror. Not all of them, some of them. And I have talked about it without mentioning their names. And I didn't think that's a violation of anything to say that so-and-so was such a mean man, he made 2 women cry.
No, I have. I've complained to maybe about some of the grand jurors that I've served with, but I've never used their names.
Right. But you can complain about what you saw, what they did.
I mean, I think you want to be you just want to be very careful. You certainly, it's the whole question of you don't want to defame anyone. I mean, one of the things when you're putting out the grand jury reports at the end of the year, the judge and the county council will review them. And he's reviewing them mainly to, well, number one, do you have jurisdiction to do this? But number two, that you're not doing anything which is libelous.
That you're not calling anybody names or anything that's bad. But you can talk about what you have learned if you don't use names.
You can do that.
In other words, in the course of it, if you learn in your investigation something that is not publicized, you can still talk about it, no?
I would not. I mean, certainly there were investigations that I was in that I learned some things in which they were very sensitive information. They didn't get into our report, but I would not talk about those.
Even they don't have any people's names attached even? Boy, this is well, remind you, all of you out there who are thinking of joining up, just remember, okay.
No, I used to joke that it was a great year for me because I wasn't allowed to talk to my wife for the entire year.
Okay. Yes. That's funny. Now, do you have a staff working for you?
There is a part-time, 20 hours a week, an administrative assistant, but most of the grand jurors now with computers and they're doing most of their own work. I mean,
typing it up.
That person is there to type and to type correspondence, and she is there to serve the grand jury if they need that. But when I was on the grand jury, I did all that myself because I'm computer literate and I didn't need it. So.
In the old days, when I was on, we didn't have a computer, but you just typed it up.
That's
the reports that then you made copies so everybody could read it.
And now the grand jury office has computers, it has copiers, it has fax machines, it has so it's a very well functioning office that way.
Now, grand jury you served on, you said you served 1 year.
That's right.
There were holdover people on it. Did you?
There were 3. No, there were two.
Held over from the year before.
One of them became the foreperson for our grand jury.
For the second year that they were on.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Do you find that it's important to continuity that there be holdovers? Is it something you would recommend that the judge have holdovers?
I think I'm mixed on it. Some people believe that it's important to have holdovers. This year's grand jury, I think now there maybe somebody dropped off, but I think it's 7 or 8. You could have, the law says you can have as many, I think is 9 or 10, I can't remember which it is. It's useful. I think that the downside to it of too much is that all of a sudden you maybe have a group of people who maybe know too much and that they can become someone intimidating to new people who are coming in.
But they won't be on the next years. They can't go 3 years.
No, it's only 2 consecutive years.
Okay, good. So now we have a new one that people are trying to get trying to get people to volunteer now to serve.
That's correct.
And do you recommend it as a?
It was one of the most satisfying years that I've spent. I've spent most of my life in public service as a consultant to government agencies and mostly to federal government and some local government agencies. But I learned things about various agencies which I found to be tremendously valuable. And the good thing about it was that in a couple of reports that we did, and they were because we were looking at perhaps they weren't being operated as efficiently or effectively as they might have been, we found that they were. And that's one of the good things that a grand jury looks at an agency and says, you know, these people are doing a pretty good job and we commend them for it. And that's as important of a grand jury report as saying, well, you've got to make some changes because you're screwing up.
Well, then I have to admit, I mean, the system was great. I learned a lot, and again, I feel we made positive contributions. It was just that some of the people were very difficult to work with. It was a challenge.
It's very difficult when 19 people were coming together for the first time, and it's supposed to be a very collegial body. Even the foreperson is equal like everyone else. Right. So that unlike a president of an organization who maybe cracks the whip or whatever, or does a number of things and make a number of decisions, the foreperson can't do that unless the grand jury allows him or her to do it. So there are some people that's very difficult to work in that very
to tone themselves
equality.
down.
Yeah,
they just don't like the fact that they're equal. They're just one of 19. They just happen to be sitting at that side of the table, and they can call the meeting to order.
That's right.
But now, is there any limit to the number of committees you can serve on?
Well, you normally would serve on 2 committees. There's some physical limitations in the grand jury office. They only have 2 meeting rooms, and so you can only have 2 committees going at the same time, unless you did it all day, I guess. So normally a person is appointed to 2 committees for the investigations, and then there are occasionally maybe another committee or 2 that someone wants to join. Usually a grand jury has an edit committee which works on the reports. Some grand juries have had public relations committees to get the word out on the grand jury.
That works well. Well, is there anything we forgot? Is there anything in all this list of things that I didn't hit you with that you really want to talk about?
Well, I am president of the former Grand Jurors Association.
Okay.
And I think that's a good testimony to the number of us who served once, and we enjoyed it enough that we like to maintain contact. And one of our main roles is to promote the grand jury, to try to get as many applications as we can. We go out, we speak to community organizations, to service clubs and whatever. We would like to get some interest in some kind of curriculum as far as for school children in the grand jury. And we are also part of something called the California Grand Jurors Association, and its responsibility is to train grand jurors every year and to watch out for legislation which might adversely affect grand juries.
Well, the main thing the league has done is we've always conducted ourselves like a grand jury is supposed to, being non-partial, trying to open our mind, studying and all that. And there is a good practice for anybody to be on a grand jury to learn how to think. You're supposed to have impartial thinking and study situation. And I think it was very interesting. You probably, if you go through the list, if they do have lists of grand jurors, you'll probably find that there's been league members on almost every grand jury that there's been, because we volunteer for that, because that is part of our desire to have good government. And if you listen to our show, we have an ending that I use, which says good government should be the usual, not the unusual. And the grand jury's goal is to keep government good, to do your best. And all of us want to do our best. Here's another opportunity for you to do your best, to go out there and join the grand jury, or try to, sign up for it, bring your impartial thinking to situations, studying the good side and the bad side, and making recommendations that hopefully will be either kudos for the good guys and a slap on the wrist for the bad guys, and maybe they'll straighten themselves up.
And you also are going to make some new friends.
Yes, I did. There are people that I did serve with who I still see.
Right.
Thank you so much, Jim, for
Thank you
coming
very
and
much for
sharing
inviting
this
me.
with it. I hope the state organization does well, and the local one does well, too. We thank you. We hope you learned something you didn't know. So when you hear about a grand jury, don't panic. Go to them if you've got problems with government, give them a chance. And if you have time, do try to join them.